She is the founder and the chief executive officer of Monarch Luxury Hotels.
Ms. Vance, thank you for this demonstration. You are fired, effective immediately.
The afternoon sun of Beverly Hills was a physical thing, a warm, golden weight that settled over the manicured hedges and impossibly clean sidewalks of Rodeo Drive. It filtered through the 20-foot floor-to-ceiling windows of the Monarch Grand's lobby, shattering into 1,000 brilliant shards across the polished Italian marble. The air inside was cool, a curated climate humming with the scent of white tea and lilies, a fragrance engineered to smell like old money. This was more than a hotel. It was a sanctuary for the global elite, a fortress of quiet luxury where discretion was the highest currency. It was also, as of 18 months ago, entirely hers. Aria Dubois paused just inside the enormous silent glass doors, letting the hum of the lobby wash over her. She adjusted the simple leather strap of her duffel bag on her shoulder. The bag, a well-loved but unbranded piece, was heavy. Her attire was deliberately anonymous, a pair of dark-washed jeans, worn soft with travel, a plain charcoal gray t-shirt and comfortable flats. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, elegant bun, and aside from a pair of understated diamond studs, she wore no jewelry. To the untrained eye, she was just another tourist, perhaps one who had wandered off the main thoroughfare, lured in by the sheer opulence of the building, soon to be intimidated back out into the California heat. This was precisely the impression she wanted to make. She began the long, deliberate walk toward the reception desk, a sweeping arc of polished obsidian that sat like an altar at the far end of the lobby. Her flats made no sound on the marble. Guests dotted the space, a man in a tailored suit speaking softly into his phone, two women with identical surgical enhancements laughing over iced coffees, and none of them gave her a second glance. She was invisible, a ghost in the machine she had built. The invisibility was a superpower, one she used to conduct her infamous incognito audits. She had visited 17 of her properties this way, a silent observer checking the true pulse of her empire. The Beverly Hills flagship, the crown jewel, was the last on her list. As she approached the desk, she saw him. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with meticulously styled blonde hair and a jawline that could cut glass. A small engraved nameplate on his lapel read, Chadwick. He was currently smiling, a dazzling practiced display of white teeth, at a woman dripping in designer labels. He laughed at something she said, a sound that was perfectly modulated to be charming but not disruptive. When the woman floated away, Chadwick's smile vanished as if it had been on a switch. His eyes swept the lobby, and when they landed on Aria, they paused for a fraction of a second too long. His perfect posture tightened. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his expression, a flicker of appraisal, then dismissal. Aria reached the desk. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice calm and pleasant. "I'd like to check in." Chadwick's eyes did a slow, insolent crawl, from her sensible shoes up to her unadorned face, before meeting her gaze. The professional warmth he'd shown the previous guest was gone, replaced by a cool, sterile politeness that was somehow more insulting than outright rudeness. "Of course," he said, the words perfectly civil, the tone dripping with condescension. "Do you have a reservation with us?" He didn't reach for his keyboard. His hands remained resting on the polished stone, his fingers steepled. "I believe so," Aria replied, maintaining her easy smile. "Under the name Dubois." Chadwick's lips tightened into a thin line. He turned to his computer, his movements slow and theatrical, as if the effort of typing her name was a profound inconvenience. He tapped a few keys, his eyes on the screen. The silence stretched. Aria could feel the weight of his judgment. It was a familiar feeling, one she had experienced 1,000 times in her life, in boardrooms and on sales floors, but it never failed to produce a small, cold knot in the pit of her stomach. It was the feeling of being measured and found wanting before she had even spoken a word. Dubois, he repeated, drawing the name out as if it tasted foul. He stared at the screen for another long moment, his brow furrowed in feigned concentration. Finally, he turned back to her, his face a mask of faux regret. I'm sorry, but I don't seem to have a reservation under that name. Are you sure it was for this location? The implication was clear. You've made a mistake. You don't belong here. Arya felt a prickle of irritation but kept her voice even. I'm quite sure. Perhaps you could check again? A-R-I-A. Dubois. He didn't move. Instead, he gave her a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. I can assure you, madam, I checked thoroughly. We have no reservation for an Arya Dubois. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, as if he were doing her a great favor. Our rooms are often booked months, sometimes years in advance. We are, after all, the Monarch Grand. He said the name of the hotel as if it were a title, a lineage she could not possibly comprehend. He was a gatekeeper, a self-appointed guardian of luxury, and in his eyes, she was an interloper, a weed in his meticulously cultivated garden. The battle of wills had begun, and Arya knew with a sinking feeling that this audit was going to be unlike any other. This wasn't about a lapse in service. This was about something much uglier, something she had spent her entire career trying to eradicate from the corporate DNA of her company. And it was happening right here, in the heart of her empire. Arya held Chadwick's gaze, refusing to be dismissed. The lobby's quiet hum seemed to amplify the tension at the reception desk. A delicate dance of power was unfolding, a silent negotiation over her right to simply exist in this space. She had faced down hostile boards and ruthless competitors, but there was a unique brand of humiliation in being stonewalled by an employee whose salary she paid. Perhaps there's been a mistake with the booking system, she suggested, keeping her tone light and reasonable. These things happen. Could you please check the arrivals list for today? It might be under a corporate booking. She was offering him an out, a way to save face while still doing his job. Chadwick's smile became a thin, bloodless line. He saw her persistence not as a customer's right, but as a challenge to his authority. His job was not just to check people in, it was to maintain the hotel's carefully curated atmosphere of exclusivity. In his mind, Arya was a disruption to that atmosphere. Madam, he said, his voice taking on the patient, patronizing tone one might use with a difficult child, our system is state-of-the-art. It does not make mistakes. As I said, we have nothing for you. He gestured vaguely to the opulent lobby around them. As you can see, we are at full capacity with our discerning clientele. The emphasis on discerning was a scalpel intended to carve her out, to separate her from the legitimate guests. He was telling her in the coded language of the service industry that she did not fit the profile. I'm not questioning the quality of your system, Arya said, her patience starting to fray. I am questioning whether you've used it properly. I flew in from New York this morning. I can assure you I have a suite booked at this hotel. The mention of New York did not impress him. If anything, it seemed to harden his resolve. He likely pictured her crammed in a coach seat, arriving with delusions of grandeur. Many people would like to have a suite at the Monarch Grand, he replied smoothly. Unfortunately, desire does not equate to a reservation. The sheer audacity of his rudeness was almost impressive. He was so secure in his judgment, so certain of his position, that he felt empowered to treat her with open contempt. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of exclusion. I'd like to speak to your manager, Arya stated, her voice losing its gentle edge and gaining a new firmness. It was a standard customer service request, but in this context it felt like a declaration of war. Chadwick's mask of politeness finally cracked. A flicker of genuine annoyance crossed his face. He saw her request as an escalation, a refusal to accept his verdict. He sighed, a theatrical exhalation of long-suffering patience. The manager is extremely busy, but I suppose I can see if she has a moment to spare. He turned away from Arya, picking up a desk phone and pressing a button. He spoke into the receiver in a low, conspiratorial murmur, his eyes darting back to her as he talked. Arya couldn't hear the exact words, but she could guess the substance of the conversation. "There's a woman here, causing a bit of a scene. Doesn't have a reservation but won't leave. Yes, you'd better come down." He was framing her as the problem, positioning himself as the calm professional handling an irrational intruder. While she waited, Arya let her gaze drift around the lobby. She saw the subtle details she had personally approved. The custom-designed sconces casting a soft, flattering light. The fresh orchids, flown in from Hawaii twice a week. The discreetly placed abstract art, part of a multi-million-dollar collection she had curated herself. She had poured her soul into creating this experience, this feeling of seamless, effortless luxury. And this man, this boy with the perfect hair and the ugly soul, was twisting her creation into a weapon of prejudice. A few yards away, a young woman was sitting in a plush armchair, phone held up in front of her. At first glance, she seemed to be on a video call, but Arya noticed the angle, the way the woman's eyes kept flicking between her phone and the drama at the front desk. She was recording, not overtly, but with the practiced subtlety of someone fluent in the language of social media. The public dimension of this confrontation had just been established. Chadwick placed the phone back in its cradle with a soft, final click. "My manager, Ms. Vance, will be with you shortly," he announced, his tone suggesting he had just summoned a divine arbiter. He then pointedly turned his attention to rearranging a stack of pristine brochures, ignoring Arya completely. He had passed judgment, and now he was passing the sentence on to his superior. The cold wall of scorn had been erected, and he stood proudly behind it, confident that it was impenetrable. Arya stood before it, equally resolute, knowing that she possessed the one thing that could shatter it into a million pieces: the truth, and she was prepared to use it. Less than a minute later, a woman emerged from a discreet door behind the reception desk. She moved with a brisk, efficient stride, her heels clicking against the marble with a sound like cracking ice. This was Tiffany Vance. She was in her mid-30s, impeccably dressed in a sharp, tailored pantsuit that screamed authority. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe, polished chignon, and her smile was a weapon, bright and predatory. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her cold, assessing eyes. She glided to a stop beside Chadwick, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "Chadwick," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "what seems to be the trouble here?" She didn't look at Arya. She addressed her subordinate first, establishing a clear chain of command and a united front. "Ms. Vance," Chadwick began, his voice laced with practiced weariness. "This lady," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm, "is insisting she has a reservation, but I've checked repeatedly and there is nothing in our system. I've explained that we are fully booked, but she refuses to accept it." Only then did Tiffany Vance turn her gaze upon Arya. It was a slow, deliberate appraisal, identical to Chadwick's but more clinical, more damning. Her eyes took in the simple t-shirt, the travel-worn jeans, the lack of ostentatious jewelry. Her predatory smile tightened. The verdict was instantaneous and absolute. "Good afternoon," Tiffany said, her voice a masterclass in false warmth. "I'm Tiffany Vance, the lobby manager. I understand there's been some confusion." "There's no confusion," Arya replied calmly, refusing to be intimidated. "I have a reservation. My name is Arya Dubois. I'd appreciate it if you would find it." Tiffany's smile never wavered. "Well, Arya," she said, using her first name with a familiarity that was meant to diminish her, "Chadwick is our best front desk agent. If he says there's no reservation, I'm inclined to believe him. Our system is integrated globally. It's quite infallible." She spoke with the unshakable certainty of someone who has never had her authority questioned. "Infallible systems are still operated by fallible people," Arya countered. "Could you have someone else check? Perhaps from the back office?" This was the wrong thing to say. The suggestion that her best agent might be incompetent, or that she herself should be second-guessed, caused a flicker of genuine anger in Tiffany's eyes. The polished mask slipped for a heartbeat. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice losing its silken edge and becoming brittle. "I think the issue here is not with our system, but perhaps with your expectations." She leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly, a pantomime of offering discreet, helpful advice. "Beverly Hills has many fine hotels. Some are more accessible than the Monarch Grand. Perhaps your booking is with one of them. It's a common mistake." The insult was breathtaking in its precision. She wasn't just saying Aria was in the wrong hotel. She was saying Aria belonged to a lower class of person, one who couldn't possibly afford a place like this. She was judging her net worth based on her outfit and her race, and sentencing her to exile from this temple of wealth. "My booking is not a mistake," Aria said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And I'm not interested in your recommendations for other hotels. I am interested in the suite that is waiting for me in this one." The confrontation had reached a new level. It was no longer about a reservation. It was a raw clash of wills. Tiffany saw a defiant, out-of-place woman challenging the established order. Aria saw a petty tyrant wielding her minuscule amount of power like a scepter, embodying the very kind of prejudice she sought to dismantle. Tiffany straightened up, her smile gone, replaced by a look of stern finality. "I believe I've been very patient," she said, her voice now cold and hard. "We have gone above and beyond to assist you, but we cannot create a reservation that does not exist. You are now disturbing the peace and making our other guests uncomfortable." She gestured to the lobby, where a few people were now openly staring. The young woman with the phone had angled it more directly, her thumb stroking the screen. She was no longer just recording, she was likely live streaming. "The only person creating a disturbance is you," Aria replied, her own patience worn to a thread. "By refusing to do your job." Tiffany's lips curled into a sneer. She had her justification now. She had offered help. She had been patient, and now she had been insulted. She had manufactured the perfect pretext to escalate. She exchanged a look with Chadwick, a silent communication that passed between them. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "I see," Tiffany said, her voice dangerously calm. "Well, we have a very clear policy for individuals who cause a scene and refuse to leave." She looked past Aria toward the main entrance and gave a small, sharp nod. "It seems this conversation is over." The air grew heavy with unspoken threat. Tiffany Vance hadn't just reinforced the wall of scorn, she had begun to brick it up, entombing Aria behind layers of polished professional prejudice. She was no longer just a manager. She was the enforcer of an unwritten code, and Aria had just been found guilty of violating it. From her plush armchair across the lobby, a young woman named Chloe adjusted the angle of her phone. The screen of her iPhone showed the live feed she was broadcasting to her 15,000 travel blog followers. The viewer count, initially hovering around 75, was climbing rapidly. 150, 270, 412. The comment stream started to scroll. "OMG, what is happening? That manager is a total Karen. Why won't they just check her reservation again? This is sus." Chloe, who ran the popular blog Globe-Trotting with Chloe, had come to the Monarch Grand for a luxury weekend getaway story. She had been filming B-roll of the opulent lobby when Aria had walked in. At first, she'd paid little attention, but the shift in the receptionist's tone had been immediate and obvious. Her blogger's instinct, honed by years of observing social dynamics for content, told her something was about to happen. She'd hit the Go Live button just as Aria calmly asked to check in. Now she was providing a hushed, whispered commentary to her growing audience. "You guys, this is insane," she whispered, her phone's microphone catching the soft words. "This woman is being so polite, and they are treating her like an actual criminal. I've stayed in hotels all over the world, and I have never seen anything like this." The drama at the front desk continued to escalate. Aria, in a final attempt to resolve the situation with reason, decided to provide tangible proof. "Look," she said, her voice firm but steady. "I don't know what the problem is, but I can prove who I am and that I have the means to be here." She reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a slim, elegant wallet. Tiffany and Chadwick watched, their faces set in stone, already convinced that whatever she produced would be a fake or irrelevant. Aria opened the wallet. For a moment, she fumbled, as if looking for her driver's license. In that brief second, a different card was clearly visible in the wallet's main slot. It was a sleek, impossibly black piece of metal, minimalist and severe. There was no bank name, no Visa or MasterCard logo. There was only the subtle, embossed golden crest of the Monarch Grand Hotel itself, and beneath it, the words, Monarch Reserve. Chloe's finger instinctively zoomed in. Her phone's camera was excellent, capturing the detail with perfect clarity. To the average person, the card meant nothing, but to anyone in the world of ultra-luxury, it was the equivalent of a royal seal. The Monarch Reserve card was an invitation-only program for the hotel chain's most valued clients and investors. It wasn't a credit card. It was a key. It granted the holder unlimited access, instant upgrades, and a level of service that bordered on telepathic. There were fewer than 100 of them in existence. To present one at a Monarch hotel was to announce oneself as royalty. The comment section of Chloe's live stream exploded. "Wait, what is that card? Zoom in, is that the hotel logo? I work in hospitality. That looks like an owner's card or something. This is nuts. Holy shit, is that a reserve card?" But Tiffany and Chadwick did not see it, or rather they chose not to. Their prejudice was a filter that rendered any contradictory evidence invisible. In their minds, a woman dressed in jeans could not possibly possess such a thing. They saw only a black woman fumbling in her wallet, and their assumptions remained unshaken. They looked right through the proof, their eyes glazed over with the certainty of their own judgment. Aria, seeing that the card had gone unnoticed, sighed internally and pulled out her driver's license instead, placing it on the counter. "Aria Dubois," she said clearly. Tiffany glanced down at the ID for a fraction of a second, then dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "A piece of plastic doesn't create a reservation that isn't there," she said haughtily. "Many people share names." It was a willful, deliberate act of obstruction. She had been presented with proof of identity and had refused to even consider it. The silent witness, Chloe, captured it all. "She's not even looking at the ID," Chloe whispered to her 1,200 viewers. "She showed them a black card with the hotel's own crest on it, and they just ignored it. This isn't about a reservation anymore. This is something else." The air crackled with tension. Aria slowly put her wallet back in her bag. She had offered them reason. She had offered them proof. They had rejected both, blinded by their own bigotry. The path of quiet resolution was now closed. They had left her with no other choice. "Fine," Aria said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. The manufactured warmth was gone, replaced by the quiet authority of a CEO about to make a difficult decision. "You've made your position perfectly clear." Tiffany mistook her quiet tone for defeat. She smiled, a triumphant, predatory glint in her eyes. "I'm glad we finally understand each other," she said, turning to Chadwick. "It seems our little problem is about to resolve itself." But Chloe, watching through her phone, knew better. The woman at the counter wasn't defeated. She was focusing her power. The silent witness knew she was about to capture the moment a storm, long brewing under a calm surface, finally broke. And she had a front-row seat. The viewer count ticked past 2,000. Aria's shift in demeanor was subtle, but to Tiffany Vance it was a confirmation of her worst suspicions. The quiet resignation in Aria's voice was, in Tiffany's twisted perception, the calm before an outburst. She had seen this pattern before, or so she told herself. People who were caught in a lie or didn't get their way would often go quiet right before they started shouting, demanding to see corporate or threatening lawsuits. Tiffany prided herself on her ability to preemptively de-escalate these situations, which in her mind meant seizing control and neutralizing the threat before it could fully manifest. "There's no need to take that tone with me, madam," Tiffany said, her voice sharp and admonishing. She took a small step back from the counter, a calculated gesture designed to signal that she felt physically threatened. It was pure theater, but it was effective. Arya looked at her, baffled. What tone? I'm simply acknowledging that you refuse to help me. You are being passive-aggressive and creating a hostile environment, Tiffany declared, raising her voice just enough to draw the attention of more guests. She was no longer just talking to Arya, she was performing for the lobby. She was building her case, witness by witness. I have tried to be reasonable, I have tried to be accommodating, but you continue to argue. This is a place of business, a place of tranquility. Our guests do not pay thousands of dollars a night to witness this kind of behavior. The hypocrisy was staggering. Every escalation, every insult, every act of aggression had originated from Tiffany and Chadwick. Yet, with the skill of a seasoned manipulator, Tiffany was flipping the script, painting Arya's resolute calmness as a sinister, calculated form of attack. Chloe's live stream captured the exchange perfectly. Her viewers were in an uproar. She's gaslighting her! Unbelievable! Hostile environment? The only hostile ones are the staff. Record everything, Chloe. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. I am not the one raising my voice, Arya pointed out, her own voice remaining steady, almost unnervingly so. This, again, was the wrong move. To Tiffany, Arya's refusal to be baited into an emotional response was further proof of a calculated deception. Anger she could handle. Tears she could dismiss. This icy calm was infuriating. It was a rejection of the role Tiffany had assigned her, that of the hysterical, entitled person making an unreasonable scene. Oh, I see, Tiffany said with a venomous laugh. This is one of those scams, isn't it? You come in, you stay calm, you push and push until we get flustered, and then you'll claim discrimination to get a free stay. I've read the training manuals. We're not falling for it. She turned to the small crowd of onlookers, her voice ringing with self-righteous conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. We are dealing with a person who is attempting to defraud the hotel. Please, do not be alarmed. We have procedures for this. She had now publicly accused Arya of being a criminal. The allegation hung in the perfumed air of the lobby, ugly and poisonous. Chadwick, emboldened by his manager's aggression, puffed out his chest and took on the air of a co-prosecutor. She was being difficult from the moment she walked in, Ms. Vance, he added, eager to contribute to the narrative. A very challenging attitude. Arya looked from Tiffany's smug face to Chadwick's eager one and felt a profound sense of weariness. This was the tax she paid for her success, the price of existing in a world that had a pre-written script for a woman who looked like her. Any deviation from that script, any display of confidence, wealth, or authority was seen as a suspicious, fraudulent act. Her calm was aggression. Her insistence was a scam. Her very presence was a crime. Accusing a guest of fraud is a very serious allegation, Arya said, each word carefully chosen. Are you certain you want that to be your official position? She was giving Tiffany one last chance to pull back from the brink. The live stream, now with over 4,000 viewers, was a ticking time bomb, and Tiffany was holding a lit match. Tiffany, however, saw the warning as a threat. It solidified her belief that this was all a shakedown. She crossed her arms, a picture of defiance. My official position is that you do not have a reservation and you are refusing to leave our private property. You have become belligerent. The word belligerent was a key piece of terminology. It was the language used in security incident reports, the word that justified a physical response. It was a trigger. This is your final opportunity, Tiffany said, her voice now devoid of any pretense of customer service. It was the cold, flat voice of an enforcer. Are you going to leave peacefully, or do I need to have you removed? The choice was a farce. By framing Arya's calm demeanor as aggression, Tiffany had already decided the outcome. She wasn't looking for a resolution, she was looking for a confrontation. She had twisted reality to fit her prejudice, and in the world she had constructed in that lobby, Arya Dubois was a dangerous aggressor who needed to be expelled. Tiffany didn't wait for Aria's answer. The question, "Are you going to leave peacefully or do I need to have you removed?" was purely rhetorical, a final piece of procedural theater before she executed the decision she had already made. Her eyes, cold and triumphant, were locked on Aria's, but her hand was already reaching for the desk phone. "Chadwick," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Call Frank Miller. Tell him we have a code 86 in the main lobby. An individual is refusing to vacate the premises and is becoming increasingly hostile." Code 86. The number was hotel jargon, but its meaning was universally understood. An unwanted person. The addition of increasingly hostile was a masterstroke of malicious invention, a phrase designed to pre-bias the security response and justify whatever came next. It transformed the situation from a customer service dispute into a security threat. Aria watched, a strange sense of detachment settling over her. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, a disaster she had the power to stop but was, for the moment, choosing to observe. Every word, every action was a data point, evidence of a systemic cancer she now knew had metastasized deep within her flagship property. This was no longer just about Chadwick and Tiffany. It was about a culture that empowered them, a system that allowed their prejudice to flourish under the guise of maintaining standards. The live stream's comment section was a waterfall of outrage. Chloe kept the phone steady, her breathing shallow. She was no longer just a blogger. She was a journalist documenting a gross injustice. Her viewer count surged past 7,000. News travels fast in the digital age. Code 86? For what? Standing there? She just lied to security. She said the woman was hostile. She has been the calmest person in that whole building. Someone call the police. The hotel staff are the ones harassing her. This is Beverly Hills. They're going to believe the manager. This won't end well. A businessman who had been observing the scene from a nearby sofa finally stood up. He was in his 50s, with a kind face and an air of quiet authority. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. "I've been watching this entire exchange. This woman has done nothing wrong. She has been perfectly calm. Your treatment of her is, frankly, appalling." Tiffany whirled on him, her eyes flashing with fury. Her carefully constructed narrative was being challenged by a witness who fit her definition of a legitimate guest. "Sir," she snapped, her voice tight with anger. "With all due respect, you do not understand the complexities of hotel security. We are dealing with a potential professional scam artist. Your interference is not helpful. For your own safety, I must ask you to step back." The businessman looked taken aback, shaking his head in disbelief before retreating to his seat, effectively silenced by her aggressive defensiveness. She had neutralized the dissenting voice, reasserting her control. The atmosphere in the lobby had grown thick and heavy. The few remaining conversations had died out. Every eye was fixed on the front desk, on the black woman in the simple t-shirt and the blonde manager who was orchestrating her expulsion. The air conditioning hummed, a low, mournful sound beneath the palpable tension. "Security is on its way," Tiffany announced to Aria, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "I suggest you reconsider your position. Leaving now on your own would be far less embarrassing for you." The offer was laced with threat. It was a promise of humiliation. The call had been made not as a last resort, but as a weapon of choice. It was the ultimate expression of her power in this small kingdom of marble and lilies, the power to decide who belonged and who was to be cast out. She had used corporate policy and security protocols as a cudgel to enforce her own personal bigotry. The system wasn't just broken, it was being actively wielded as a weapon, and it was aimed directly at the woman who owned it. Aria braced herself. The enforcer was coming. The man who emerged from a hallway marked "Staff Only" was the physical embodiment of dispassionate authority. Frank Miller was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, with a shaved head and a meticulously trimmed beard. His uniform was a simple but perfectly tailored black suit, the words "Monarch Security" embroidered in subtle gray thread on the breast pocket. He wasn't a brutish bouncer. He was a corporate soldier. His expression was neutral, his eyes giving nothing away. He moved with an efficient, gliding walk that spoke of years of training and experience. He didn't rush. He assessed the scene as he approached. Tiffany standing ramrod straight behind the desk, Chadwick looking both nervous and excited, and Arya standing alone in the vast, open space, seemingly calm. He also noted the handful of guests watching, their phones held up. His gaze lingered for a second on Chloe's live stream setup before he dismissed it. Public recording was a modern nuisance, but it didn't change his protocol. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. He addressed the manager first, acknowledging the chain of command. "You reported a code 86? "Yes, Frank," Tiffany replied, her voice regaining its composure now that her backup had arrived. She gestured toward Arya. "This individual was told we have no reservation for her and has refused multiple requests to leave the property. She has become disruptive and hostile." Frank Miller turned his full attention to Arya. His eyes were not like Chadwick's, filled with insolent judgment, nor like Tiffany's, glinting with malicious glee. They were flat, empty. He looked at Arya not as a person but as a problem to be solved, a situation to be managed. This calculated indifference was, in its own way, more chilling than the overt hostility. To him, the context didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. All that mattered was the directive from management. "Ma'am," he began, his tone polite but inflexible. "I'm Frank Miller, head of security. I've been informed that you've been asked to leave the hotel premises." "I was not asked, I was ordered," Arya corrected him quietly. "And your manager's report is inaccurate. I have not been hostile." Frank gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was the nod of a man who had heard this 1,000 times. Everyone claimed they weren't hostile. Everyone claimed the report was inaccurate. It was all just noise to him. "My job isn't to determine what happened before I arrived," he stated, his voice a calm, unshakable monotone. "My job is to respond to the current situation. The situation right now is that management has determined you are no longer welcome on the property. That makes you a trespasser. I need to escort you out." He was a machine of liability mitigation. His words were carefully chosen from a corporate-approved script. He was creating a legal firewall with every syllable. He wasn't a person making a moral judgment. He was an asset of the monarch grand, protecting it from a perceived threat. "And if I refuse?" Arya asked, testing the limits of the encounter. "Then I will be forced to remove you physically," Frank replied without a flicker of emotion. "And the Beverly Hills Police Department will be called to formally charge you with trespassing. It will be a far more unpleasant experience for you. I assure you that is not a path you want to go down." He stood between her and the reception desk, a human wall. He wasn't aggressive, but his presence was an undeniable show of force. His hands were relaxed at his sides, but she could see the coiled strength in his forearms. He was a professional, and that made him far more dangerous than some hot-headed security guard. Chloe's live stream was now a frenzy of activity. The viewer count had surpassed 10,000. Her feed was being shared across multiple platforms. "He won't even listen to her side of the story." "My job isn't to determine what happened. That's the problem right there." "This is how it works. The system protects itself. They'll just close ranks and throw her out." Tiffany watched, a smug, satisfied smile playing on her lips. This was the culmination of her power play. The hotel's security apparatus had been mobilized to validate her prejudice. The system was working exactly as she intended. She had successfully defined Arya as a threat, and the enforcer had arrived to neutralize that threat without question. Frank took a half step forward. It was a subtle, non-threatening movement, but it was a clear signal. The time for talking was over. "Ma'am, please," he said, his voice still calm, still dispassionate. "Let's not make this difficult. Let's just walk to the door." He was the final gear in a machine of exclusion, a machine that ran on assumption and was lubricated by indifference. He felt no malice toward Arya. He felt nothing at all. And that was the most terrifying part. He was simply doing his job, and his job was to remove the woman who owned the very ground he was standing on. The moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Every person in the Monarch Grand's lobby seemed to be holding their breath. Arya looked at Frank Miller's impassive face, then at Tiffany's triumphant smirk. She had pushed this as far as it could go. She had given them every opportunity to reverse course, to choose decency, to simply do their jobs. They had refused at every turn. Now she had to see the protocol through to its ugly conclusion. She needed to experience the full systemic failure of her own company. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of fear. Frank's posture relaxed infinitesimally. The situation was being de-escalated. A physical confrontation would be avoided. "Thank you for your cooperation, ma'am," he said, the professional courtesy sounding obscene in the context of what was happening. "If you'll please walk with me." He gestured toward the massive glass doors, a silent command. He didn't touch her, not yet. He maintained a respectful distance of a few feet, walking slightly behind her, guiding her with his presence rather than his hands. It was a practiced, professional escort, designed to look as smooth and non-confrontational as possible, all while being an act of profound degradation. Arya turned and began the walk of shame. It was a far longer walk than the one she had made upon entering. The polished marble floor now seemed like a vast, empty stage, and she was the sole actor in a tragedy. She kept her head held high, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Her heart was pounding, a cold fury mixing with a deep, personal pain. This was her hotel. Her name was on the charter. Her vision was in the architecture. Her money was in the bank. And she was being thrown out of it like a piece of trash. The eyes of the guests followed her, a mixture of pity, discomfort, and morbid curiosity. The businessman who had tried to intervene watched with a look of profound disgust. Chloe's phone tracked her every step, the live stream broadcasting her humiliation to thousands of strangers. The digital world was her only witness, her only jury. As they reached the halfway point of the lobby, Arya slowed her pace slightly. "For the record," she said, speaking to Frank without turning to look at him, "my name is Arya Dubois. You will want to remember that." Frank Miller's expression did not change. The name meant nothing to him. "Noted, ma'am," he replied, his tone still flat, dismissive. He considered it the parting shot of a disgruntled trespasser, a meaningless attempt to assert some form of identity in the face of institutional power. They reached the towering glass doors. A uniformed doorman, seeing the head of security escorting someone out, rushed to pull the heavy door open, his face a mask of polite neutrality. He avoided making eye contact with Arya. The complicity of the system was everywhere. As she stepped from the cool, lily-scented air of the lobby into the warm, exhaust-tinged air of the Beverly Hills afternoon, Frank Miller spoke one last time. "You are now formally trespassed from this property. If you attempt to re-enter, you will be arrested immediately. Do you understand?" "Oh, I understand more than you can possibly imagine," Arya said, her voice a low promise. She turned to face him, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her eyes. It wasn't fear or anger. It was something harder, something that looked like resolve. The heavy glass door swung shut between them, the sound a soft, final thud. It sealed her out, leaving her on the sidewalk alone. Inside, Tiffany Vance allowed herself a small, victorious smile. She smoothed down the front of her jacket, the crisis averted, the interloper expelled. The natural order of her world had been restored. Arya stood on the curb, the sun warm on her skin. The sounds of the city, the purr of a passing Bentley, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of tourists, seemed unnaturally loud after the curated silence of the lobby. She took a deep breath, calming the storm raging inside her. This was not a defeat. It was the end of the diagnostic phase. Now the treatment would begin. She reached into her duffel bag, her hand closing around her phone. The humiliation was complete. The reckoning was about to begin. Standing on the sun-drenched sidewalk with the monolithic facade of the Monarch Grand looming behind her, Aria Dubois felt a clarifying calm descend. The humiliation had been a fire, but it had burned away any remaining uncertainty, leaving behind only the cold, hard steel of purpose. She was no longer conducting an audit. She was launching a counteroffensive. She unlocked her phone, her thumb moving with practiced efficiency across the screen. She ignored the dozens of notifications, emails from her executive team, alerts from the stock market, a message from her mother. She went straight to her contacts, scrolling past senators, billionaires, and celebrity friends. She was looking for one name. She found it and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a man's voice, harried but professional, answered. Mr. Thorne's office, this is Alex speaking. This is Aria Dubois, she said, her voice level. Put him on. Now. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. The assistant, Alex, had likely been trained to gatekeep for his boss, to schedule calls and manage his time. But the name Aria Dubois was a master key, one that unlocked any door in the company. Ms. Dubois! Of course, right away, ma'am. I'm so sorry. The fumbling apology was cut short by the sound of the phone being hastily transferred. A new voice came on the line, this one deeper, tinged with a mixture of surprise and immediate concern. Aria, is everything all right? I wasn't expecting your call. Marcus Thorne, the regional director for the Western United States, was a man who prided himself on his unflappability. He managed a portfolio worth billions, overseeing 5 of the company's most profitable hotels. He was a good executive, competent and ambitious. He was also a man who understood exactly who he worked for. An unscheduled call from the CEO's personal cell phone during an incognito audit was the corporate equivalent of a nuclear alert. No, Marcus, everything is not all right, Aria said, her voice dangerously quiet. She turned and looked back at the hotel, at the doorman who was now studiously avoiding her gaze. I'm standing on the sidewalk outside our Beverly Hills flagship. She let the words hang in the air. She could almost hear the gears turning in Marcus's head, the frantic calculation. She's there now? Why is she outside? Outside? He repeated, his voice tight with confusion and dawning horror. Did your car... Is there a problem with the entrance? The problem, Marcus, Aria said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of glass, is that your lobby manager, a woman named Tiffany Vance, and your head of security, Frank Miller, have just thrown me out of my own hotel. I have been formally trespassed. Dead silence. The kind of profound, absolute silence that follows a catastrophic explosion. Aria could picture Marcus Thorne in his cushy office 30 floors above downtown LA, his face draining of color, his hand gripping the phone. He would be trying to process the sheer impossibility of what he had just heard. It was a career-ending nightmare unfolding in real time. What? He finally stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Aria, that can't be right. There has to be a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Aria cut him off, is that they think they still have jobs. You are in your car and you are on your way here. I want you on this curb, standing next to me in 10 minutes, not 11. 10. The command was absolute, leaving no room for questions or debate. It was the voice of a monarch giving an order to a courtier. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said, his voice now stripped of all its executive bluster, replaced by the meek tone of a terrified subordinate. I'm leaving right now. 10 minutes, I'll be there. Ms. Dubois, I am so sorry. Save your apologies, Marcus, Aria said, her eyes fixed on the glass doors. You're going to need them for the board. 10 minutes. She ended the call without waiting for a reply. The ultimatum had been delivered. The clock was ticking. For 10 minutes, she was a trespasser, a pariah, a non-person. But in 10 minutes, the entire power structure of the Monarch Grand Beverly Hills was going to be turned upside down. She leaned against a stone planter, crossed her arms, and waited. The sun was warm, but a cold front was on its way. The 9 minutes that followed were a study in surreal tranquility. Aria stood her ground on the sidewalk, an island of calm amidst the bustling river of Beverly Hills life. Tourists snapped photos of the hotel, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Valets in crisp burgundy uniforms sprinted to and from exotic cars. From her vantage point, Aria could see Tiffany through the glass, laughing with Chadwick at the front desk. They were celebrating their victory, confident in the righteousness of their actions. They looked, Aria thought, like fools dancing on the edge of a volcano. At precisely the 9.5-minute mark, a gleaming black Lincoln Navigator, the kind favored by government officials and high-level executives, swerved aggressively to the curb, its tires chirping in protest. The passenger door flew open before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. Marcus Thorne emerged, practically tumbling onto the sidewalk. He was a man in his early 50s, usually the picture of tailored corporate elegance. Now his tie was askew, his face was pale and slick with sweat, and his eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was almost comical. He spotted Aria and stumbled toward her, his expression that of a man pleading for his life. "Ms. Dubois," he breathed, his voice ragged. "Aria, there are no words. I came as fast as I could. You're here, Marcus," Aria said, cutting off his frantic apologies. "That's what matters for now." She gave him a quick, dismissive look, taking in his disheveled state. "Pull yourself together. We're going inside." She turned and began walking toward the entrance, not waiting to see if he followed. He scrambled to keep up, straightening his tie and trying to compose his features into something resembling authority, but failing miserably. The doorman, who had watched the entire scene with growing unease, saw them coming. He recognized Marcus Thorne instantly. Panic flickered in his eyes. He had just witnessed this woman being thrown out, and now she was returning with the regional director, who looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The doorman's mind raced, trying to comprehend the new power dynamic. He lunged for the door, pulling it open with a flourish, his face a mask of strained servility. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Dubois," he stammered, using her name for the first time. "Welcome to the Monarch Grand." Aria paused in the doorway and looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "A little late for that, don't you think?" she said softly, before sweeping past him into the lobby. The atmosphere inside changed instantly. The quiet, confident hum of the lobby faltered. Guests who had witnessed the earlier incident now stared, their mouths agape. They saw the same woman in the plain jeans and t-shirt, but now she walked with an undeniable aura of power. And the terrified man trailing in her wake was clearly a high-level executive. Tiffany and Chadwick were still at the front desk. Tiffany was in the middle of a story, a smug smile on her face. She saw the doorman's frantic gesture and looked up. Her smile froze, then melted from her face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of utter disbelief. Her eyes darted from Aria to the ashen-faced man beside her. She knew exactly who Marcus Thorne was. She had been in dozens of meetings with him. Her mind, which had been so quick to judge and condemn, was now struggling to process a reality that was suddenly, violently tilting on its axis. Chadwick's reaction was slower. He saw his manager's face go white and followed her gaze. He saw the woman, then he saw Mr. Thorne. Confusion warred with a dawning, sickening sense of dread on his face. This didn't make sense. The pieces didn't fit. Aria did not rush. She walked with the same deliberate pace she had used when she first entered. But this time, the walk was different. It wasn't the approach of a hopeful guest. It was the slow, measured advance of a queen returning to her throne room to find it occupied by traitors. The simple clothes that had been their justification for scorn now looked like a disguise, a test they had catastrophically failed. The clicking of Marcus Thorne's expensive shoes on the marble was the only sound, a frantic, nervous rhythm against the dead silence of the lobby. He looked at Tiffany and Chadwick, a murderous fury in his eyes, but he said nothing. He waited for his queen to speak. Aria came to a stop directly in front of the obsidian desk, in the exact same spot where she had stood not 15 minutes earlier. She placed her hands on the cool stone and looked at the two employees who had judged, condemned, and exiled her. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with panic and confusion. The power dynamic had not just been reversed, it had been shattered. The silence in the lobby was a physical entity, a crushing weight that pressed down on everyone present. Tiffany Vance's mind was a maelstrom of denial and terror. This had to be a mistake, a coincidence. Perhaps this woman was Mr. Thorne's estranged daughter, or a mistress he was trying to appease. Any explanation was better than the one that was beginning to form, cold and terrifying, in the deepest recesses of her mind. Chadwick simply stared, his mouth slightly ajar. The world, which had seemed so simple and well-ordered just moments ago, had ceased to make any sense. Arya let the silence stretch, forcing them to marinate in their own fear. She let them look at her, really look at her for the first time. Not as a stereotype, not as a social class, but as the woman who held their professional lives in the palm of her hand. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a diamond, clear and hard and utterly unforgiving. "Well," she began, a hint of icy irony in her tone, "this has been an extraordinarily illuminating visit." She looked directly at Tiffany. "Ms. Vance, when you and I spoke, you offered me your professional assessment. You diagnosed me as a scammer. You accused me of attempting to defraud the hotel. You determined that I was belligerent and hostile. You are, as Chadwick noted, the best. So tell me, is that still your assessment?" Tiffany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face was a brittle white mask. The practiced confidence, the sneering superiority had evaporated, leaving behind only raw, primal fear. Arya's gaze shifted to Chadwick. "And you," she said, her voice softening with mock sympathy, "you were so certain, weren't you, that no one named Dubois had a reservation? You were so sure of the infallibility of your system. You looked right at me and decided I didn't belong." Chadwick flinched as if he'd been struck. He looked desperately toward Tiffany, but she offered no support. He then glanced at Marcus Thorne, who was staring at him with an expression of such pure loathing that Chadwick felt a cold dread snake up his spine. Arya straightened up, taking her hands off the desk. She turned slightly to include Marcus in the conversation, though she never took her eyes off her two terrified employees. "Marcus," she said, her voice returning to its normal, authoritative tone, "I believe there has been some confusion regarding my identity. Perhaps you could clear it up for Ms. Vance and Mr. Myers." Marcus, who had been vibrating with a mixture of rage and terror, stepped forward. He looked as if he was about to explode, but he reined in his anger, his voice coming out as a strangled, furious whisper. "This," he said, gesturing to Arya with a trembling hand, "is Ms. Arya Dubois. She is not a guest. She is not a scammer." He paused, letting the words sink in, twisting the knife. "She is the founder, the majority shareholder, and the chief executive officer of Monarch Luxury Hotels and Resorts worldwide. This is her company. This is her hotel. You are standing in her lobby." The words dropped into the dead silence like stones into a deep well. Chadwick made a small choking sound and swayed on his feet, grabbing the edge of the counter for support. Tiffany's carefully constructed world shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a sickly grayish color. Her eyes, wide with horror, were fixed on Arya. It wasn't possible. The woman in the jeans, the woman she had sneered at, belittled, and had thrown out onto the street, was the owner, the ultimate authority, the architect of her entire career. The realization was so catastrophic, so absolute, that her mind simply refused to process it for a moment. Chloe's live stream, which now had over 25,000 viewers, caught every devastating second. The comment stream was a blur of capital letters and exclamation points. "CEO! Oh my God, I knew it! They are so fired, beyond fired, launched into the sun! This is the best thing I have ever seen!" Arya let the revelation settle, enjoying the profound karmic justice of the moment. Then she delivered the verdict. She looked at Tiffany, whose eyes were now swimming with tears of panic. "Ms. Vance, Thank you for giving me such a clear and unfiltered demonstration of the customer service standards you've implemented here. It's been educational." She paused. "You are fired, effective immediately." Her gaze moved to Chadwick. "Mr. Myers, your commitment to gatekeeping and protecting the hotel's image is noted. It is also, however, catastrophically misplaced. You are also fired, effective immediately." She then looked past them, her eyes finding Frank Miller, who had been standing frozen near the entrance, the color draining from his face as he finally understood the magnitude of his error. "Mr. Miller!" she called out, her voice sharp. He flinched, then walked stiffly toward the desk, his face a mask of grim resignation. "Your professional indifference and failure to assess a situation before acting is a liability my company can no longer afford. You are fired, effective immediately." She turned to Marcus. "Marcus, have their personal effects gathered. Escort them off my property, now." The sentence had been passed. The execution was swift and absolute. There were no second chances, no HR meetings, no quiet resignations. It was a public and total termination, a direct and brutal consequence for their actions. The moment of reckoning was complete. The aftermath of the firings was a scene of controlled chaos. Marcus Thorne, snapping into action with the desperate efficiency of a man trying to save his own career, began issuing quiet but firm orders into his phone. Two assistant managers, their faces pale and bewildered, appeared from a back office. One began the process of deactivating keycards and network access, while the other was dispatched to oversee the collection of personal belongings. Tiffany Vance had started to cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears of remorse, but the loud, gasping sobs of someone whose world has just ended. "Please," she choked out, looking at Aria with desperation. "Ms. Dubois, I have a mortgage. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." "You made a choice," Aria corrected her, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "You made dozens of choices. You chose to judge me. You chose to lie. You chose to escalate. You chose to humiliate. These are not mistakes. They are reflections of your character." Chadwick was silent, his face ashen. He seemed to be in a state of shock, staring into the middle distance as if he couldn't comprehend the reality of the situation. Frank Miller, ever the professional, simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the staff locker rooms without another word. He understood the finality of the command. As the three disgraced employees were led away, Aria turned her attention to the rest of the lobby. The guests, who had been silent observers, were now murmuring amongst themselves. And Chloe's live stream was still active, the viewer count having skyrocketed past 50,000. Her feed had been picked up by news aggregators and was rapidly going viral. Aria knew this was a critical moment. It could be perceived as a personal act of vengeance by a slighted CEO, but it was much more than that. This was a teaching moment, a chance to turn a personal humiliation into a public declaration of her company's values. She took a few steps away from the desk, into the center of the lobby, and addressed the assembled crowd, her voice carrying a calm, resonant authority that commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her gaze sweeping across the guests and, by extension, the thousands watching online. "First, I want to apologize. I apologize for what you've had to witness today. You came to the Monarch Grand expecting a sanctuary of peace and hospitality, and instead you were subjected to a disgraceful display of prejudice." She paused, letting her apology sink in. It was a powerful act of humility from a person in a position of ultimate power. "What you saw here was not just the failure of three individuals," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Individual failure is easy to fix. We just did that. What you witnessed was a profound, systemic failure, a failure of culture, a failure of training, and ultimately, a failure of my leadership for allowing such a culture to take root in the first place." This was a masterful stroke. She was taking responsibility, framing the problem not as a few bad apples, but as a rot in the barrel itself. Monarch Luxury Hotels is a global corporation with over 15,000 employees, serving millions of guests a year. Our annual revenue exceeds $2 billion. This hotel, she said, gesturing to the opulent space around her, is our crown jewel. It generates more than $300 million a year. But these numbers, she said, her voice dropping slightly, are meaningless if we fail at our most basic promise, to treat every single person who walks through our doors with dignity and respect. She began to pace slowly, her simple clothes in stark contrast to the power of her words. The protocols that Ms. Vance and Mr. Miller followed were, on paper, correct. They identified a potential threat, they escalated, and they removed it. The problem is that their definition of a threat was not based on actions. It was based on appearance. It was based on prejudice. They saw a black woman in jeans, and their entire system, their entire training, led them to one conclusion. She doesn't belong here. She stopped and looked directly into the lens of Chloe's phone, as if speaking to every single one of her viewers. This is the poison of unconscious bias. It turns hospitality into hostility. It turns sanctuaries into fortresses. It creates a culture where employees believe their primary job is not to serve, but to judge. And that is a cancer. It is a cancer that I allowed to grow in my own house. Today, we begin the process of cutting it out. The speech was transformative. It elevated the incident from a shocking viral moment into a case study on corporate responsibility. Aria was deconstructing the failure in real time, showing a level of transparency and self-awareness that was virtually unheard of in the corporate world. She wasn't just firing the guilty, she was indicting the entire system that produced them. The reckoning was not just for 3 employees, it was for the soul of her entire company. The lobby of the Monarch Grand had transformed from a stage for drama into a lecture hall. Aria stood at its center, not as a victim or an avenger, but as a leader defining a new path forward from the wreckage of the old one. The firings had been the amputation. Now came the difficult, painful work of ensuring the disease would never return. Apologies and terminations are not enough, Aria declared, her voice resonating with unwavering conviction. They are merely the first step. They address the symptom, not the cause. The cause is a corporate culture that has become complacent, a system that has prioritized perceived security over genuine inclusivity. Therefore, effective immediately, I am announcing the most comprehensive, top-to-bottom reform in this company's history. Marcus Thorne, who had returned to her side, looked visibly nervous. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew it would be audacious and expensive. First, Aria announced, holding up a single finger, we are implementing a zero-tolerance policy on discrimination of any kind. Not the 3 strikes policy buried in our current HR manual. I mean 0. 1 verified act of discrimination based on race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or economic appearance, and you are terminated. No appeals, no exceptions. We will be the most aggressively inclusive hospitality company on the planet. A gasp went through the small crowd. It was a radical, uncompromising stance. Second, she continued, we are establishing a new independent office of inclusivity and guest experience. This office will report directly to me, not to regional management or HR. It will have its own budget and full authority to investigate any and all complaints from both guests and employees, anonymously and with complete protection from retaliation. Their findings will be binding. This was a direct blow to the existing power structure, a system where managers like Tiffany could dismiss complaints and protect their own. Third, every single one of our 15,000 employees, from the boardroom to the laundry room, will undergo a new, mandatory, and continuous bias and sensitivity training program. This will not be a one-time online module you can click through. It will be an immersive, ongoing curriculum designed by leading sociologists and psychologists. Certification will be required for continued employment and promotion. Marcus Thorne visibly paled at the logistical and financial implications. This would cost millions. Fourth, Aria's voice grew stronger, more passionate. We are launching what I am calling the Monarch Standard. It will be a new public-facing commitment to our guests. It will state in simple terms that if any guest ever feels they have been treated with less than total dignity and respect, their entire stay is free, no questions asked. We will stand behind our promise with our most valuable asset, our revenue. This was the most shocking announcement of all. It was a radical, terrifying, and brilliant promise. It weaponized customer satisfaction, giving every single guest the power to hold the company accountable financially. The potential for abuse was enormous, but the message it sent was undeniable. We trust our people to be excellent, and we will pay the price if they are not. Chloe's live stream was now being hosted on major news sites. The viewer count was over 100,000 and climbing. The hashtag Monarch Standard was starting to trend on Twitter. This will be expensive, Aria acknowledged, as if reading Marcus's mind. The initial investment in training and technology will exceed $20 million. The potential cost of the Monarch Standard is even higher. Our shareholders will likely be nervous. Our profits may dip in the short term. But let me be perfectly clear. The cost of prejudice is always higher. The cost of a viral video like the one being filmed right now is higher. The cost of losing a single customer to discrimination is higher. And the cost of moral bankruptcy, she said, her voice dropping to an intense whisper, is a price I am not willing to pay. She let her words hang in the silent lobby. She had not consulted her board, her CFO, or her legal team. She had, in the span of 5 minutes, unilaterally committed her multi-billion-dollar company to a revolutionary and costly new path. It was an act of breathtakingly decisive leadership, forged in the fire of personal humiliation. She looked at the faces of the guests, the assistant managers, and the doorman. She looked at Marcus, who seemed to be in a state of shock and awe. She had taken the ugliest moment in her company's recent history and was turning it into its defining moment of triumph. She was not just cleaning house, she was rebuilding it from the foundation up, on a new set of principles, right in front of the entire world. 6 months to the day, the lobby of the Monarch Grand Beverly Hills was bathed in the same golden afternoon light. The marble gleamed, the lilies and white tea scented the air, and the quiet hum of money and influence was as palpable as ever. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath the surface, everything was different. Aria Dubois stood near the entrance, dressed this time in a sharp, elegant business dress, though she still drew no more attention than any other well-heeled guest. She was observing, not with the critical eye of an auditor, but with the cautious pride of a gardener checking on a newly planted garden. At the front desk, a young man with a warm, genuine smile was checking in a family. The father was black, dressed in a sharp suit. The mother was Latina, elegant and poised, and their 2 children were buzzing with excitement. The desk agent, a new hire named David, treated them with an easy, unforced respect. He knelt down to speak to the children directly, asking them if they were excited to use the rooftop pool, earning a delighted giggle from the youngest. There was no hesitation, no subtle second glance, no request for extra verification. There was only hospitality. This was the fruit of the $20 million investment. This was the Monarch Standard in action. The viral video of Aria's ordeal, captured by Chloe, had been viewed over 80 million times. It had become a cultural touchstone, a lightning rod for discussions on race, class, and corporate accountability. It was now a required case study at Harvard Business School. In the wake of the scandal, 3 other major hotel chains had announced their own watered-down versions of inclusivity initiatives, a testament to the seismic impact of that one afternoon. The Office of Inclusivity and Guest Experience had become the most powerful department in the company. It had investigated over 400 complaints in 6 months, resulting in 17 further terminations company-wide. The message was clear. The new rules were not just for show. Aria watched as David handed the family their key cards. "Enjoy your stay with us, Mr. and Mrs. Garcia," he said with a smile. If there is anything at all you need, please don't hesitate to ask." The father paused. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "We were a little nervous coming here after, you know, but this has been wonderful." David's smile didn't falter. "We know, sir," he replied quietly, "and we're working every day to be better than our past. Welcome to the new Monarch Grand." Arya felt a swell of pride so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. That was the unscripted, genuine proof of change. It was in the quiet confidence of the Garcia family and in the empathetic professionalism of a young employee who understood the weight of his company's recent history. Her reflection was interrupted by an approaching figure. It was Chloe. The 6 months since the incident had been a whirlwind for her. Her blog had exploded. She had been offered a full-time position as a special correspondent for a major news network, focusing on stories of corporate culture and social justice. "Ms. Dubois," Chloe said, a professional microphone now in her hand instead of an iPhone. "Thank you for agreeing to this follow-up." "Arya, please," she corrected her with a warm smile. "And thank you, Chloe. In a way, none of this would have happened without you." "I just filmed what I saw," Chloe said. "You're the one who turned it into a revolution." They began to walk through the lobby, Chloe's cameraman trailing them. "So, 6 months on," Chloe began her interview, "the Monarch Standard. Your critics said it was a reckless, financially ruinous PR stunt. But your stock is up 18%. Guest satisfaction is at an all-time high. What do they get wrong?" "They get a fundamental truth of business wrong," Arya replied, her voice calm and assured. "They believe that dignity is a line item, a cost to be managed. But it's not. It's an investment. When people feel seen, respected, and safe, they return. They bring their friends. They become your ambassadors. We didn't just invest in bias training, we invested in loyalty. We invested in humanity. And it turns out, humanity is very good for business." The lobby, once a scene of her deepest professional humiliation, was now a testament to her greatest triumph. It had been reborn, not just as a symbol of luxury, but as a symbol of what was possible when a leader decides that the bottom line is not just about money, but about the measure of human decency. The change was real, it was tangible, and it was only the beginning. As the interview continued, Chloe steered the conversation toward the wider impact of what had happened in this lobby. "It's not just Monarch that's changed," she prompted. "The term, the Monarch Standard, has become a hashtag, a shorthand for corporate accountability. Other companies are now being asked by their customers and employees, 'What's your Monarch Standard?' Did you ever anticipate that your response would have such a ripple effect?" Arya paused, considering the question. They had stopped near the grand fireplace, the heart of the lobby. "Honestly, no," she admitted. "That afternoon, I wasn't thinking about a movement. I was thinking about a promise. The promise of hospitality. The promise that when you see our name, you know you are safe, you are welcome, you are valued." My response was simply a desperate, and I suppose very public, attempt to keep that promise. "But it became a movement," Chloe pressed. "We've seen it with airlines, with retail chains, even with tech companies. Your actions raised the bar for everyone." "What happened here wasn't unique," Arya explained. "The injustice, the prejudice, that happens every single day in 1,000 different places. The only thing unique about that day was that the person it happened to had the power to burn the old system to the ground and build something new from the ashes. The legacy of that day shouldn't be about me. It should be the understanding that accountability is not a punishment. It's a tool for growth. The companies that are embracing that are thriving. The ones that are fighting it are becoming relics." The cameraman captured the quiet intensity in Arya's eyes. This was not the rehearsed speech of a polished CEO. It was the deeply held conviction of a leader who had been tested by fire. "Let's talk about Tiffany Vance, Chadwick Myers, and Frank Miller," Chloe said, broaching the sensitive topic. "There was a significant online backlash against them, but also a vocal minority who felt the public firings were too harsh. They lost their careers in an instant, on a global stage." Arya's expression didn't change. Her resolve was unshakable. And I lost my dignity in an instant, on a global stage. The difference is, my dignity was stripped from me because of the color of my skin and the clothes I was wearing. Their careers were lost because of the choices they made. They weren't fired for a single mistake. They were fired for a pattern of behavior, for a deeply ingrained prejudice that they wielded as a weapon. In my company, there is no room for that. I don't believe accountability can ever be too harsh. I believe a lack of accountability is infinitely harsher on the victims of prejudice. Her answer was unequivocal, a masterclass in staying on message. She expressed no regret, only a steadfast commitment to her principles. As they wrapped up the interview, Chloe's producer gave her a signal from off-camera. Chloe's face lit up. "We have something we wanted to show you," she said, pulling out a tablet. She tapped the screen and turned it to face Aria. It was a news clip from a local station in Phoenix. A manager at a rival hotel chain, a young white man, was shown calmly and firmly defending a Muslim family wearing traditional dress from the verbal abuse of another guest. The manager was standing between the family and their harasser, saying, "Sir, we don't tolerate that kind of language here. Every guest in my hotel is treated with respect. That's the standard." The harasser was then escorted out. The news anchor came back on screen. A brave act from a young hotel manager who told our reporter he was inspired by the Monarch Standard, a new bar for hospitality set by Monarch Hotel's CEO, Aria Dubois. Aria watched the clip, and for the first time her professional composure cracked. Her eyes welled up with tears. It wasn't just about her company anymore. The ripple had become a wave. A young man in another city, in another company, had seen what was right and had the courage to act on it, armed with a new vocabulary and a new framework for decency. He had a standard to uphold. "That," Aria said, her voice thick with emotion as she looked up from the tablet. "That is the legacy. That is what makes it all worthwhile." The viral video of her humiliation had given birth to something powerful and unexpected. A viral legacy of accountability. It was no longer just her story. It had become a shared ideal, a standard of decency that was spreading from one lobby, one person, one act of courage to the next. Later that evening, Aria stood in the penthouse suite, the very suite she had been trying to check into 6 months ago. A vast expanse of glass offered a panoramic view of Los Angeles, a sprawling carpet of glittering lights under a velvety night sky. The suite was silent, a stark contrast to the noise of that day and the subsequent media storm. In the quiet, the full weight of the past 6 months settled upon her. She had won. By every conceivable metric, she had turned a disaster into the single greatest triumph of her career. Her company was more profitable, more respected, and more culturally relevant than ever before. She had become an icon, a celebrated voice for corporate responsibility. But standing here, looking out at the city, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt the profound, humbling weight of leadership. The events of that day had forced her to confront a painful truth. The systems she had built were not enough. Policies, training manuals, corporate mission statements. They were all just words on paper, meaningless without the unwavering commitment of the people tasked with implementing them. She had created a body, but she had failed to give it a soul. The soul of a company wasn't found in its branding. It was forged in its moments of crisis. It was defined by what its leaders were willing to fight for when everything was on the line. She had fought, and she had won. But the victory felt precarious. It depended on constant vigilance. The Monarch Standard was not a finish line. It was a starting line for a race that would never end. The fight against prejudice, against the lazy, corrosive habit of judging others by their appearance, was a daily one. It had to be fought in every hiring decision, every training session, every customer interaction. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Marcus Thorne. It was a single screenshot of an internal employee satisfaction survey. The numbers were staggering. A 40% increase in reported job satisfaction. a 60% increase in employees reporting they felt proud to work for Monarch Hotels. The highest marks were from minority employees, who reported a massive jump in feelings of safety, respect, and opportunity. That, she thought, was the real metric of success. Not the stock price, but the quiet confidence of a family checking in. Not the glowing media profiles, but the pride her employees now took in their work. She had not just changed a policy, she had changed the lives of 15,000 people, giving them a cause to believe in, a standard to uphold. The power she wielded was immense, and that day had taught her how carefully it must be used. It would have been easy to handle the situation privately, to fire the 3 employees quietly and move on. But she had chosen the public stage. She had chosen to turn her humiliation into a lesson, knowing that true change requires not just action, but witness. Justice, she had learned, must not only be done, it must be seen to be done, so that its echo can inspire others. The young manager in Phoenix was proof of that echo. As she turned from the window, her gaze fell upon her reflection in the dark glass. She saw the woman in the power dress, the celebrated CEO. But for a fleeting moment, she also saw the woman in the worn jeans and t-shirt, standing alone on the sidewalk, a storm of cold fury in her heart. She would never forget that woman. She was a constant reminder of the stakes, a permanent sentinel guarding against the complacency that had allowed the rot to set in. The weight of leadership was the duty to remember her, to fight for her, and to build a world where she would never have to exist again. The fight wasn't about revenge, it was about redemption, not just for her company, but for an ideal of hospitality that had been tarnished. It was about proving that excellence, decency, and profitability were not mutually exclusive, but were, in fact, inextricably linked. That was the wisdom she had earned. That was the weight she was now proud to carry. When we look back at a moment like the one that ignited this story, it's easy to focus on the fire, on the dramatic confrontation and the satisfying retribution. But the real story, the more human one, lies in the kindling. What allows a Tiffany or a Chadwick to behave with such casual cruelty? It's rarely pure, mustache-twirling villainy. More often, it's a toxic cocktail of insecurity and a desperate need for significance. In the tiny kingdom of a hotel lobby, enforcing an unwritten, prejudiced social order was their only way to feel powerful. They saw Arya's simple clothing not just as out of place, but as a personal affront to the fragile status they had built for themselves. Their prejudice was a shield for their own profound lack of self-worth. If they had taken just 1 second to pause, to breathe, to truly see the person in front of them instead of the stereotype in their head, the entire catastrophe could have been avoided. And what if Arya hadn't been the CEO? The thought is chilling. If she had been just a regular person, her story would have ended with the closing of those glass doors, another forgotten injustice, another soul wounded by a world that judged her unworthy. That's why building systems to protect the powerless is the ultimate responsibility of the powerful. The Monarch Standard wasn't just a policy, it was a promise that a person's dignity should not depend on their job title or their credit limit. This story is a reminder that the world is changed not by grand, sweeping gestures, but by individual choices made in crucial moments. It's about the courage to speak up when you see injustice, the integrity to take responsibility when you failed, and the wisdom to know that a company's true value is measured in the way it treats every single human being. Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone was being judged unfairly? What did you do? Or what do you wish you had done? Share a time when a simple act of kindness or respect made a huge difference in your day. Let's fill the comments with stories that prove decency is our greatest strength.